The wedding had over 200 guests. Crystal chandeliers shimmered above a room designed for perfection. Every detail was controlled. Every movement rehearsed. Nothing here was supposed to go wrong. Until the glass slipped. It wasn't loud. It didn't shatter. Just a small mistake, barely noticeable. "I apologize," the waitress said calmly. But the bride turned. "Are you serious right now?" Her voice cut through the air sharper than the sound of the glass ever could. The room didn't stop, but it changed. The waitress stood still. Composed. Silent. And that's when he saw it. Not the mistake. Not the moment. But her. The way she chose to respond when she thought it didn't matter. "I can't do this," he said. And just like that, the wedding stopped. If you're ready for a story about power, dignity, forbidden love, and the sweetest revenge you've ever witnessed, then you're in the right place. Hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications because this channel brings you the most addictive romance stories you won't find anywhere else. Drop a fire in the comments if you're team revenge. And let's get into this story. 8 months before that moment, no one in that ballroom knew her name. And that was exactly how she preferred it. She moved through spaces like that, quietly, efficiently, without ever becoming part of the story. High-end events, private functions, rooms filled with people who measured value in power and presence. She had worked enough of them to understand something most people didn't. You could learn everything about someone, without them ever speaking to you. It was never in the big moments. Not the speeches. Not the smiles. Not the carefully constructed versions of themselves they showed the world. It was in the small things. The things they thought didn't matter. The way they spoke to staff when no one important was listening. The way their tone shifted when the audience changed. The way patience disappeared when control slipped. That's where the truth lived. And she had trained herself to see it. Not because she wanted to, but because experience had made it necessary. Her name was Nia. Mid-20s. Black American. Professional in every sense of the word. She wore her uniform the same way she carried herself. Clean, precise, intentional. Hair pulled back into a neat bun. Movements controlled. Voice measured. There was no room for error in places like that. And even less room for reaction. So she didn't react. She adjusted. Adapted. Moved forward. Because in her world, composure wasn't just professionalism. It was protection. That night, the venue was unlike most others she had worked. Larger. Louder. More important. Not in size alone, but in the weight of the people inside it. You could feel it before you even stepped fully into the room. Security was tighter. Conversations were quieter. Smiles were more calculated. This wasn't just a wedding. It was an alignment. 2 families. 2 networks. 2 systems of influence coming together under one roof. And everything about it reflected that. The lighting was warm, but deliberate. The decor elegant, but controlled. Nothing excessive. Nothing accidental. Even the silence between conversations felt managed. Nia noticed all of it. She always did. She stepped into the ballroom with a tray balanced effortlessly in her hands, her posture straight, her pace steady. Around her, other staff moved quickly, quietly, each person locked into their role. No mistakes. No distractions. No attention. That was the rule. And she followed it. But as she moved through the room, something caught her attention. Not loudly. Not obviously. Just enough to register. A presence. Near the front of the room, surrounded, but somehow separate. He wasn't speaking. He wasn't moving much either. But people adjusted around him without realizing they were doing it. That told her everything. Power didn't need to announce itself. It reshaped the space around it. She didn't stare. Didn't slow down. Just passed by, placing a glass on a table, her eyes flicking up for less than a second. Long enough to register details. Korean. Early 30s. Impeccably dressed. Posture relaxed, but controlled. His expression neutral, almost unreadable. But his eyes. They weren't passive. They were watching. Not scanning the room like most people did, looking for status, for recognition, for validation. He was observing. Deliberately. Carefully. Like he was studying something no one else had noticed yet. And for a brief moment, just a fraction of a second, his gaze shifted. Not to the guests. Not to the center of the room. To her. She didn't react. Didn't break stride. Didn't change pace. Because attention like that could mean many things. And none of them required acknowledgement. Still, she registered it. Stored it. And moved on. Across the room, the bride stood surrounded by guests. She was exactly what the room expected her to be. Elegant. Composed. Effortlessly polished. Her smile was perfect. Her posture flawless. Every movement calculated to match the setting she stood in. She knew how to exist in a space like this. You could tell. Because she didn't just fit into it. She controlled it. People leaned toward her when she spoke. Laughed when she smiled. Adjusted their tone without realizing it. That kind of presence didn't happen by accident. It was learned. Refined. Practiced. And perfected. Nia noticed that too. But she noticed something else. Something smaller. Something easier to miss. The way the bride's expression shifted, just slightly, when she turned away from guests and toward staff. Not enough to draw attention. Not enough to be called out. But enough to exist. A tightening around the eyes. A flattening of the smile. A tone that dropped just below polite. It lasted seconds. Then it disappeared. Replaced instantly with warmth as she turned back to the room. Most people wouldn't catch it. But Nia did. Because that was the part people didn't rehearse. The part they didn't think anyone important was watching. And that's where the truth always slipped through. She adjusted her grip on the tray slightly, moving past another table, her expression unchanged. Professional. Neutral. Invisible. But internally. She had already noted it. Not as a judgment. Just information. Because moments like that didn't mean much on their own. They never did. But sometimes, they were the beginning of a pattern. And patterns always led somewhere. And as the night continued, with laughter filling the room and everything appearing exactly as it should, no one realized. They had already seen the first crack. They just didn't know it yet. The first time he noticed her, it wasn't intentional. Not in the way people usually notice someone in a room like that. It wasn't about presence. It wasn't about appearance. It was about interruption. Not of the event. Of expectation. A glass had been placed slightly off-center on a table, barely noticeable, but enough to break the symmetry of everything around it. One of the guests reached for it without looking, his attention still on the conversation in front of him. Before the glass could tip, she was already there. A quiet correction. A subtle adjustment. No apology needed. No acknowledgement expected. The moment never existed. Except, he saw it. From across the room, his gaze shifted, not to the guest, not to the table, but to her. She didn't linger. Didn't check for approval. Didn't look around to see if anyone had noticed. She simply moved on. And that stayed with him. Because in a room where everything was designed to be seen, she had done something invisible. And done it perfectly. Across the hall, laughter rose from a cluster of guests gathered near the bride. She stood at the center of it, exactly where she was supposed to be. Effortless. Refined. Her voice carried just enough to be heard, but never enough to feel forced. Every gesture calculated. Every expression controlled. She was performing. And she was good at it. But perfection, he knew, was often a surface. And surfaces eventually cracked. Champagne? The voice was soft. Professional. He turned slightly. She stood beside him now, tray balanced in one hand, her posture steady. Up close, the details were clearer. No wasted movement. No unnecessary expression. Just focus. He took a glass. Thank you, he said. She nodded once. No smile. No lingering eye contact. Just acknowledgement. Then she moved on. And somehow, That made the moment feel real. It started small. It always did. A comment here. A shift there. Nothing loud enough to draw attention. Nothing obvious enough to question. But enough to register. Careful. The bride's voice came from behind, light, almost playful. But not quite. A server, different from Nia, paused mid-step, adjusting her grip on a tray. "I'm sorry," the server said quickly. "It's fine," the bride replied, already turning away. But the tone stayed behind. Flat. Dismissive. Temporary. Like the moment itself. Most people didn't notice. Why would they? There was nothing to notice. No raised voice. No insult. No scene. Just a word. Just a tone. Just a shift. But he heard it. And more importantly, he felt it. Across the room, Nia had heard it too. Not because she was listening for it, but because she had learned to recognize it. There was a difference between correction and dismissal. And this leaned closer to the second. Still, she didn't react. Didn't look up. Didn't pause. She simply continued her route, placing glasses, adjusting settings, maintaining the rhythm she had built. Because reacting would change nothing. But observing? That was different. Observation built understanding. And understanding always mattered. Time passed. Minutes folded into conversations. Conversations into laughter. The room remained perfect. But the moments, they continued. Small. Contained. But consistent. Not like that. A hand gesture this time. Subtle. Directed at another member of staff. The correction itself wasn't wrong. But the delivery. Again, just slightly off. Just enough to remove dignity. Just enough to assert distance. He watched it happen. Not directly. Not obviously. But enough to connect it. One moment. Then another. Then another. Individually. They meant nothing. Together. They began to form something else. "You don't perform." The words came out before he fully considered them. She paused. Just slightly. Enough to acknowledge the interruption. Then she turned toward him. There was no confusion in her expression. Just attention. "What do you mean?" she asked. Her voice was calm. Measured. He studied her for a second. "Most people in rooms like this," he said slowly, "they're aware of being seen." She didn't respond. Didn't need to. "You're not," he finished. A brief silence. Not uncomfortable. Just present. Then, a small shift in her expression. Not quite a smile. But something close. "I'm working," she said simply. And that was it. No elaboration. No attempt to engage further. She turned. And moved on. Leaving the sentence exactly where it was. He watched her go. Not because of interest. Not entirely. But because of contrast. Because in a room built on performance, she was the only one not participating. And that made her impossible to ignore. Near the center of the room, the bride's laughter rose again. Perfect. Timed. Controlled. He looked toward her. And for a moment, everything aligned. The setting. The expectations. The outcome. This was what had been arranged. What had been decided. What made sense. And yet, something about it no longer felt complete. Not wrong. Just unfinished. Because once you notice a difference, you start comparing everything against it. And comparison creates questions. Across the room, another moment. A tray passed too close. A guest shifted unexpectedly. A glass wobbled. Caught. Again. Before it became visible. He exhaled quietly. Not consciously. Just enough to register something internal shifting. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't immediate. But it was there. A change in perspective. A shift in focus. A question forming. Before it had words. And as the night continued, and the room held together under the weight of its own perfection. He realized something he hadn't expected. He wasn't just noticing the moments anymore. He was waiting for them. Because once you start seeing a pattern, you don't just observe it. You anticipate it. And what he didn't realize yet was that the pattern was about to become impossible to ignore. It didn't happen all at once. It never does. There wasn't a single moment where everything shifted, no loud realization, no sudden clarity that forced a decision. Instead, it built. Quietly. Piece by piece. Like something assembling itself just beneath the surface. And once it reached a certain point, it became impossible to ignore. The next evening was smaller. More private. Less spectacle, more intention. A pre-wedding dinner arranged for close connections, people who mattered beyond appearances. The room was quieter, but heavier. Conversations carried more weight. Smiles were more deliberate. And expectations, even sharper. Nia moved through it the same way she always did. Invisible. Precise. Controlled. The kind of presence that only existed to support everything else. And yet, just like before, she noticed everything. "Excuse me." The bride's voice soft. Directed. Nia stepped forward instantly. "Yes, ma'am. This isn't what I asked for." Her tone wasn't raised. It didn't need to be. Nia glanced at the table setting. Everything appeared correct. Placement aligned. Presentation intact. "Still." She nodded. "I'll fix it." A pause. Not from Nia. From the bride. A fraction longer than necessary. "You should have gotten it right the first time." There it was. Not loud. Not aggressive. But deliberate. A statement, not a correction. And for the first time, the silence that followed didn't disappear immediately. It lingered. Just long enough for someone else to hear it. He didn't look up right away. Didn't need to. He had heard enough. But when he did, he didn't look at the table. He didn't look at the setting. He looked at her. The waitress. Because he already knew what he would see. No reaction. No defense. No shift in posture. Just acknowledgement. And movement. "I understand," she said quietly. Then she adjusted the setting. Clean. Efficient. Complete. And stepped away. Like the moment had never existed. But it had. And now, it stayed. He leaned back slightly in his chair, his gaze following her for a moment longer than necessary. Then, back to the bride. She was already smiling again. Engaged in conversation. Seamless. Untouched by what had just happened. And that was the part that stayed with him. Not the words. Not even the tone. But the transition. The ease. The absence of awareness. Or maybe, the absence of concern. Across the room, another moment. A server reached across a guest slightly too early. A small mistake. Harmless. Correctable. But before the correction could even be made. Not now. Sharp. This time. Just slightly more visible. The server froze. Apologized quickly. Stepped back. And again. The moment dissolved. Or at least, it appeared to. But something was changing. Not in the room. In him. He wasn't just observing anymore. He was measuring. Comparing. Testing. Each interaction against the last. Each tone against the previous one. And every time, the result was the same. Consistency. Across the room, Nia noticed it too. Not the pattern itself, but the shift in attention. The way his gaze lingered longer than before. The way he wasn't just watching the room. He was studying it. That wasn't normal. Not for someone in his position. Not for someone about to be married. People like that didn't observe. They were observed. Still, she didn't engage. Didn't change her rhythm. Didn't acknowledge it. Because attention wasn't something she needed. But awareness? That was different. And awareness told her something simple. He was seeing it now. "You missed a spot." The bride again. Different server. Different moment. Same tone. Same delivery. Same result. The server quickly corrected herself, murmured an apology, and stepped away. And once again, the bride turned back to her guests. Smile restored. Voice softened. Presence flawless. That's when it clicked. Not as a thought. Not as a realization. But as a certainty. It wasn't stress. It wasn't pressure. It wasn't the situation. It was her. And once that understanding settled, everything else aligned around it. Every previous moment. Every subtle shift. Every quiet dismissal. They weren't isolated. They weren't accidental. They were consistent. And consistency is truth. He exhaled slowly. Not out of frustration. Not even anger. Just clarity. Across the room, Nia passed by again. Tray steady. Movement controlled. And for a brief moment, their eyes met. No expression. No acknowledgement. But something passed between them anyway. Not connection. Not recognition. Understanding. Because they were both seeing the same thing now. Just from different sides of it. He leaned forward slightly, resting his hands against the table. The conversation around him continued. Voices layered over each other. Laughter rising and falling. But it all felt distant. Muted. Like background noise behind something sharper. He looked toward the bride again. And this time, he wasn't seeing her as she appeared. He was seeing her as she behaved. And those were two very different things. You're quiet. Her voice pulled him back. He looked at her. She smiled. Concerned. Engaged. Perfect. Just thinking, he replied. About? A pause. Not long. But enough. Patterns, he said. She laughed lightly. Not understanding. Not needing to. Always analyzing, she said. And turned back to the conversation. But he didn't. Because analysis leads to conclusion. And conclusion leads to decision. And somewhere beneath the surface of everything that had been planned, everything that had been arranged, everything that had been expected, a decision was beginning to take shape. Not fully formed. Not yet spoken. But present. And once a decision exists, even quietly, time becomes a countdown. And as the night came to an end, with everything still intact on the surface, he realized something he couldn't ignore anymore. It wasn't one moment. It was never just one moment. It was a pattern. And patterns don't change overnight. But they do. Eventually reveal exactly where they lead. By the time the wedding approached, nothing looked out of place. That was the unsettling part. Everything still worked. The timing was perfect. The arrangements flawless. The families aligned exactly as they were meant to. From the outside, nothing had shifted. But inside, everything had. The days leading up to the ceremony moved quickly. Meetings. Finalizations. Confirmations layered on top of expectations. Every detail double-checked. Every moment accounted for. Because something like this wasn't just an event. It was a statement. And statements like that couldn't afford cracks. But cracks don't always show on the surface. Sometimes, they exist underneath. Quiet. Invisible. Waiting. He noticed it more now. Not because it had changed. But because he had. Where before he had seen isolated moments. Now he saw continuity. Where before he had heard tone. Now he understood intention. And intention is harder to ignore. The final rehearsal dinner was smaller. More controlled. Only those who needed to be present. The room was quieter than before, but more precise. Conversations weren't casual anymore. They were strategic. Measured. Nia moved through it the same way she always did. Steady. Composed. Focused. But the atmosphere was different now. Tighter. Less forgiving. The margin for error had disappeared completely. Excuse me. The bride again. But this time, There was no softness in it. Nia approached. Yes, ma'am. The bride didn't look at her immediately. She finished adjusting her bracelet first. A small detail, but deliberate. Then, she turned. This isn't acceptable. Her voice was low, controlled, but firm. Nia glanced at the table. Nothing obvious stood out. Still, she nodded. I'll correct it. A pause. Longer this time. Heavy. You should have already known to. The words landed differently. Not as a correction. Not as feedback. But as expectation. And for the first time, someone else reacted. Not Nia. Not visibly. But the person seated closest to the interaction shifted slightly in their chair. Subtle. But real. Because something about it felt off. Nia didn't respond. Didn't defend. Didn't explain. She adjusted the setting. Perfectly. Then stepped back. But this time, the silence didn't disappear immediately. Because now, people were starting to notice. Across the room, he watched. Not casually. Not passively. But fully. There was no doubt anymore. No uncertainty. No room left for interpretation. It wasn't stress. It wasn't nerves. It wasn't the pressure of the event. This was her. And more importantly, this was who she became when nothing was at stake. He exhaled slowly. But there was no relief in it. Only confirmation. Everything okay? Her voice again. Soft. Concerned. He turned toward her. Her expression was perfect. Genuine. Warm. And for a moment, it almost worked. But once you see the difference, you can't unsee it. Of course, he said. And the words sounded right. Even if they no longer felt that way. She smiled. Satisfied. And turned back to the table. The duality was seamless. Effortless. Almost practiced. And that's when it became undeniable. It wasn't inconsistency. It was control. She knew exactly who to be. And when. Across the room, another moment. A server carrying a tray hesitated slightly as someone crossed in front of her. A minor disruption. Recoverable. But before it could resolve. Watch where you're going. Sharper now. Less filtered. The server froze. Apologized quickly. And moved away. But this time, someone else looked up. Then another. Then another. It was still quiet. Still contained. But it was spreading. Awareness. And awareness changes the room. Nia noticed it immediately. The shift. The subtle difference in how people responded. The way conversations paused just a fraction longer. The way eyes lingered just a second more. The pattern hadn't changed. But the audience had. And once something has an audience, it becomes real. She continued working. Same pace. Same composure. Same control. Because the moment you react, you become part of it. And she refused to do that. But internally, she understood. This was no longer invisible. And across the room. So did he. He leaned back slightly, his gaze fixed not on the interaction itself, but on the space it left behind. The discomfort. The silence. The absence of ease. Because that's where truth lives. Not in the action, but in the reaction. And the reaction was clear. This wasn't normal. Tomorrow will be perfect. Her voice again. Confident. Certain. He turned toward her. And for a moment, everything aligned again. The expectation. The outcome. The path that had already been decided long before either of them stood in that room. It should have felt inevitable. Instead, it felt fragile. Of course, he said. But this time, there was something else behind the words. Not doubt. Decision. Not fully formed. Not yet spoken. But present. Because once clarity sets in, it doesn't leave. And clarity had already done its work. Across the room, Nia moved past again. Their eyes didn't meet this time. They didn't need to. The understanding had already been established. And now, everything was moving towards something unavoidable. The rehearsal ended. People stood. Chairs shifted. Conversations resumed as if nothing had happened. But something had. And it couldn't be undone. Because the difference between what was expected and what was true had finally become too clear to ignore. And as the night came to a close, with everything still intact on the surface, he realized something that changed everything. Tomorrow wasn't the beginning. It was the moment of truth. And the truth was already decided. The wedding day arrived exactly as planned. Perfect. That was the word everyone used. Perfect venue. Perfect timing. Perfect alignment of power and expectation. Nothing out of place. Nothing left to chance. Even the air felt controlled. Guests filled the room in layers. Quiet conversations. Measured laughter. Observant glances. Everyone understood what this was. Not just a ceremony. A consolidation. A moment that would echo beyond the room itself. At the center of it all, everything waited. Nia stepped into the ballroom with the same composure she had carried through every event before it. Nothing about her changed. Same posture. Same control. Same quiet awareness. Because for her, this wasn't a moment. It was a job. But the room felt different. Heavier. Not louder. Just tighter. As if something unseen had already settled into place. She moved between tables, adjusting placements, checking alignment, ensuring everything remained exactly as it should be. No mistakes. No disruptions. And yet, somewhere beneath the surface, something was already shifting. At the front of the room, he stood waiting. Black tuxedo. Impeccable. Still. From the outside, nothing about him suggested hesitation. No movement. No visible tension. But inside, everything had already been decided. He wasn't waiting to choose. He was waiting for the moment. The music began. Soft at first. Then rising. Guests turned. Conversations faded. And she appeared. The bride. Walking slowly down the aisle, every step deliberate, every movement practiced to perfection. Her expression was exactly what it needed to be. Warm. Poised. Certain. Everything aligned. Everything made sense. Until it didn't. It happened quickly. Too quickly for anyone to anticipate. Too small for anyone to expect. A tray shifted. A single glass tilted. Just enough to break the illusion. Nia caught it. Almost effortlessly. The liquid barely moved. The sound. Almost non-existent. "I apologize," she said. Soft. Controlled. And for a moment, that could have been the end of it. But moments like that don't exist in isolation. They reveal something. And this one did. The bride stopped. Mid-step. The music faltered, just slightly. Not enough to stop. But enough to be felt. Her head turned. Slowly. Toward Nia. And then, it happened. "Are you serious right now?" Her voice wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. Because the room was already silent. Every word landed. Sharp. Clear. Unavoidable. Nia didn't move. Didn't react. "I apologize," she repeated. But the bride stepped closer. Close enough to remove distance. Close enough to make it personal. "You had one job," she said. A pause. And then, something crossed the line. Her hand reached out, grabbing Nia's wrist. Not violently, but firmly. Deliberately. The room froze. Because now, this wasn't subtle anymore. This wasn't tone. This was visible. And visibility changes everything. Nia didn't pull away. Didn't resist. Her expression remained the same. Calm. Controlled. "I'll correct it," she said. No emotion. No escalation. Just resolution. And somehow, that made it worse. Because her composure highlighted everything else. The imbalance. The control. The assumption. And across the room. He saw it. Not as a moment. But as confirmation. Everything he had noticed. Everything he had observed. Everything he had understood. Now existed in a single, undeniable point. There was no interpretation left. No explanation. No doubt. The bride released her wrist. But the moment didn't release the room. It stayed. Heavy. Unavoidable. And that's when he moved. Not quickly. Not dramatically. Just forward. Each step deliberate. Measured. Final. The music stopped. This time. Completely. Every eye shifted. Toward him. Toward what was about to happen. He stopped in front of her. The bride turned. Confusion flickering behind composure. "What are you doing?" she asked. Her voice was quieter now. Controlled. Trying to regain balance. But balance had already shifted. "I can't do this." The words didn't echo. They didn't need to. Because the silence carried them further than sound ever could. The room held its breath. "What?" she said. A single word. Fragile. Uncertain. "This isn't about the mistake," he said. His voice calm. Even. Clear. A pause. "This is about who you are when it doesn't matter." The sentence landed. And this time, it didn't disappear. It stayed. Because everyone had seen it. They just hadn't named it. Until now. The bride's composure cracked. Not completely. But enough. "You're doing this, here?" she asked. Her voice tightening. "You're ending this over that?" He didn't hesitate. "No," he said. And the words settled deeper than anything else. "I'm ending this because it was always there." Another pause. "And I finally chose to see it." Silence. Real silence. The kind that doesn't recover immediately. The kind that changes things. Around them, guests shifted. Some looked away. Others watched more closely. But no one spoke. Because there was nothing left to say. The moment had already said everything. He stepped back. Not waiting for a response. Not asking for understanding. Because the decision had already been made long before this moment. This was just where it became visible. The bride stood still. Composure trying to return. But something had already broken. Not loudly. But permanently. And as he turned, walking away from everything that had been planned, expected, and assumed, the room didn't stop him. Because it understood. Even if no one said it out loud. And as the doors closed behind him, leaving silence, shock, and truth in their wake, one thing became clear. This wasn't the moment everything fell apart. It was the moment everything finally made sense. After he walked away, the room didn't recover. Not immediately. Conversations didn't resume the way they usually do after a disruption. There was no quick adjustment, no forced laughter to smooth things over. Just fragments of silence. People standing where they were, processing something they hadn't expected to witness. Because moments like that don't fade. They settle. By the time the guests began to leave, the perfection that had once filled the room felt distant. Replaced by something quieter. Something more real. Outside, the air was different. Less controlled. Less rehearsed. He stood there for a moment, still in his tuxedo, the weight of everything behind him, but none of it pulling him back. Not anymore. He wasn't second-guessing. He wasn't replaying the moment. Because the decision hadn't been made in the room. It had been made long before that. The room had just revealed it. A few hours later, long after the venue had emptied, Nia stepped outside. Her shift was over. The uniform still precise. The posture unchanged. As if nothing had happened. But something had. She saw him before he said anything. Standing a short distance away. Waiting. Not expectantly. Not urgently. Just present. "I saw what happened," he said. She nodded once. "I know." A pause settled between them. Not heavy. Not awkward. Just honest. "You didn't stop that wedding for me," she said. It wasn't a question. No, he replied. Another pause. I stopped it because I finally saw clearly. She studied him for a moment. Not searching. Just understanding. Then she nodded again. And that was enough. No dramatic shift. No sudden connection. No resolution wrapped in certainty. Just clarity. And sometimes, that's the only thing that matters. As he turned to leave, and she stepped in the opposite direction, neither of them looked back. Because they didn't need to. What had been seen couldn't be unseen. And what had been decided didn't need to be explained. For the first time in a long time, everything was exactly as it was supposed to be. Just not in the way anyone had expected. Because in the end, it was never about the glass. It wasn't about the interruption. And it wasn't even about the wedding. It was about a moment. A moment where nothing was supposed to matter. And yet, everything did. So tell me, was he right to walk away? Or did one moment cost her everything? And more importantly, do you think people really reveal who they are? In the moments they believe don't count? Let me know what you think. And if you've ever witnessed a moment like that, you already understand why some decisions can't be undone.